in the rugged heart of Utah's high desert wildlife. Experts and historians remain stunned after a wild Mustang appeared at retired veterinarian George Martin's doorstep, carrying a 130-year-old cavalry saddlebag filled with historical treasures that had vanished in the 1890s, uncovering a forgotten chapter of American history, involving native tribes, cavalry scouts, and the Mustangs themselves. Elves as development threatens both the horse's habitat and the newly discovered historical sites. George's simple act of feeding a hungry wild Mustang during a devastating drought has sparked an extraordinary partnership that continues to reveal buried secrets in the sun-baked hills of Dry River, leaving experts to wonder what other mysteries this remarkable animal will uncover as he leads the aging farmer deeper into the wilderness with each passing day. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches, you make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Three Pines Farm. As George Martin climbed stiffly from his weathered pickup truck, at 62 his movements were deliberate every step, a negotiation with joints that reminded him daily of decades spent tending livestock. He surveyed his property with a critical eye. 30 acres of land that had been in his family for 3 generations, now struggling through the worst drought to hit Dry River in 50 years. George adjusted his worn leather hat, shielding his eyes from the harsh glare. The pastures that should have been lush with summer growth were brittle and brown, the soil cracked and thirsting. His gaze traveled to the distant hills of Liberty Mesa where wild Mustangs still roamed free, their lives increasingly threatened by shrinking resources and expanding development. "Come on, Max," he called to the border collie. Waiting patiently in the truck bed, the dog jumped down with practiced ease, circling once before settling into a comfortable trot beside his master. Together they walked the fence line bordering the eastern edge of the property where the farm met public land. George carried fence pliers and a coil of wire, stopping occasionally to mend weak spots. It was routine maintenance, the kind of work that kept his hands busy while his mind wandered. "Been 3 years. Today, Max," he said quietly, not looking at the dog. 3 years since Ruth left us." Max went softly, as if understanding the significance of the date. George's wife had always been the optimist of the pair, believing the farm could thrive even as neighboring properties sold out to developers without her. George struggled to find reasons to continue the fight as he worked his way along the fence. Something on the horizon caught his eye, a flash of movement against the dusty landscape. George paused, squinting. Into the distance, a horse stood alone on a ridge about 50 yards beyond his property line, watching him with unusual intensity. "Well, would you look at that?" George murmured. Max barked. Once ears perked forward, the horse didn't startle or flee, which struck George as odd for a wild Mustang. Instead, it maintained its position, a magnificent dun stallion with a dark mane and a distinctive white blaze running down its face. Even from this distance, George could see the animal's ribs prominent beneath its dusty coat. The drought had been hard on the wild herds, pushing them to seek water and forage in places they'd normally avoid. This one looked desperately hungry. George reached into his pocket, pulling out the apple he'd planned to eat with. His lunch, he held it up, considering, then made a decision that would change everything, slowly making no sudden movements. He approached the fence line. "Easy there," he called softly, using the gentle tone he'd developed over decades of veterinary work. "Not going to hurt you." The Mustang's ears flicked forward, nostrils flaring to catch George's scent. It took a tentative step closer, then another caution. Wearing with hunger, George placed the apple on a fence post and backed away. "There you go, not much, but it might help," Max weed again, but stayed obediently at George's side. As the farmer retreated 20 paces, the Mustang watched them, head high alert for any threat or trick, then decision made. It approached the fence with deliberate steps with surprising delicacy. The horse took the apple from the post, consuming it quickly but without the frantic desperation George had expected. Throughout the entire process, the Mustang's dark eyes never left George's face. "You're welcome," George said, feeling slightly foolish for talking to a wild animal. Yet something in those eyes seemed to understand when the apple was gone. The horse remained by the fence for a long moment, studying George with an intensity that went beyond animal curiosity. Then, with a soft nickering sound, it turned and trotted back toward Liberty Mesa, disappearing over a ridge. That was strange. George said to Max as they continued their fence repairs. Never seen a wild one come that close before. Later that afternoon, as George filled water troughs for his remaining livestock, just 2 horses and a small herd of goats these days, Sheriff Howard Cooper's patrol vehicle rolled up the dusty driveway. "Afternoon, George," Howard called, climbing out with the easy confidence of a longtime friend at 58. The sheriff had a weathered face that matched the landscape he'd patrolled for nearly 3 decades. Howard George acknowledged with a nod. "What brings you out to?" "My little patch of nowhere." The sheriff leaned against his vehicle, pushing his hat back slightly. "Thought you should know Albert Thornton's people were at the county office again this morning. They've expanded their resort proposal to include parts of Red Rock Valley." George's face darkened. "That's right up against Liberty Mesa. The Mustang herds use that valley for water access, I know." Howard sighed. "They're claiming the drought is proof. The land can't sustain the herds anyway. They've got some environmental impact study saying managed development would be better than what they're calling overgrazing by feral horses." "Feral horses," George spat the words. "Those Mustangs have been here longer than any of us preaching to the choir, George. Just thought you'd want to know, seeing as your property borders the affected area." George nodded, grateful for the warning. "Thornton offered to buy you out again?" Howard asked. "Changing the subject slightly every month, like clockwork," George confirmed. "Last offer was double market value. You thinking about it?" "No shame if your farming's a young man's game these days." George filled the last water trough before answering. "This land was my grandfather's, then my father's. It'll be mine until I die. Then Peter's if he wants it, though. I doubt Chicago banking left him much appreciation for dirt and hard work." The mention of George's estranged son hung in the air between them for a moment, before Howard nodded. "Well, there's a meeting at the courthouse next Thursday about the development proposal. Might want to show up. Make your voice heard. I'll be there after the sheriff left." George sat on his porch watching the sunset paint Liberty Mesa in shades of gold and crimson. He thought about the Mustang. From that morning wondered if it would survive the drought without fully examining his decision. He set a bucket of apples and carrots by the door, planning to take them to the fence line in the morning. That night, George dreamed of Ruth. In the dream, she was standing in a field of wild grass that swayed in a breeze he couldn't feel, with mountains that seemed both familiar and strange rising behind her. "You always see what's in front of you, George." "Dream," Ruth told him with a smile. "But sometimes you need to look deeper to find what's been there all along." He woke before dawn, Ruth's words lingering like the remnant of a song outside. A light rain pattered against the metal roof, the first precipitation in weeks. George made coffee and watched the sunrise through windows strewn with moisture, feeling a strange anticipation he couldn't name. As he headed out to begin morning chores, bucket of fruit and vegetables in hand, Max suddenly barked sharply from his position by the window. The dog raced to the door, tail wagging frantically. "What is it, boy?" George pulled on his jacket against the light drizzle. "Coyote in the yard again." Max barked once more, then scratched at the door with unusual urgency. George opened it. Peering into the misty dawn, what he saw stopped him. Cold standing calmly in his yard. Not 20 feet from the porch was the Mustang from yesterday. Its dun coat was darkened by rain, the white blaze on its face gleaming in the early light. It watched George with those same intelligent eyes, but it wasn't the Mustang's presence alone that caused George's coffee mug to slip from his fingers. Next to the horse, placed deliberately on the ground like an offering, was a weathered leather saddlebag, its surface cracked with age and exposure. "What in the world?" George whispered. The Mustang nickered softly, the same unusual sound from their previous encounter, then stepped backward several paces, not fleeing, but creating space. It seemed to be waiting for something. George set his bucket down and slowly descended the porch steps, keeping his movements measured and calm. Max followed, unusually subdued, sensing the importance of the moment. The saddlebag was old, far older than anything George had in his barn. Its leather was a deep brown, worn thin in places, with tarnished brass buckles and what appeared to be military markings, partly obscured by mud and time. George approached cautiously, speaking softly. "Where did you get this fellow?" The Mustang watched intently as George crouched beside the saddlebag, not touching it, yet simply examining it. The horse poured, The ground once then used its muzzle to nudge the bag towards George in a gesture impossible to misinterpret. "You want me to take it?" George murmured in amazement. "You brought this for me." As if confirming, the Mustang dipped its head in a motion that eerily resembled a nod. George slowly reached out and lifted the saddlebag. It was heavier than expected, its contents shifting slightly. The leather was damp from the light rain, but something inside seemed to be protected. "Thank you," George said, feeling strange for expressing gratitude to a wild animal, yet somehow certain the horse understood in response. The Mustang tossed its head dark-lock, falling across one eye, then backed several more steps away. It remained at the edge of the yard, the rain darkening its coat, watching as George carried the saddlebag to the porch. "You want to come under cover?" George asked, gesturing to the overhang again. The horse seemed to understand, walking slowly to the edge of the porch, but not climbing the steps, positioning itself where it could observe while staying dry. George placed the saddlebag on the porch table and carefully opened the weathered flap inside, wrapped in what appeared to be oilcloth that had protected it from moisture was a leather-bound journal, several yellowed papers, and what looked like a hand-drawn map. "My God," George breathed gently, opening the journal's cover with trembling fingers inside. Faded but legible handwriting filled the pages, the date at the top of the first entry, reading April 17th, 1887. The name on the inside cover made his heart race. Field notes of James Westfield, 7th Cavalry Scout Westfield. George whispered, the scout who disappeared. Every schoolchild in Dry River grew up hearing about James Westfield, a cavalry scout who had vanished while exploring the mountains around Liberty Mesa. Local legend held that he had discovered something significant, but disappeared before he could report his findings. Over the decades, his story had become regional folklore, spawning countless amateur treasure hunts and theories. George looked up at the Mustang, who remained watching him steadily from the edge of the porch. "How did you find this?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. "And how did you know to bring it here?" The horse nickered softly, then turned to look toward Liberty Mesa, visible in the distance through the light rain. The gesture was unmistakable, an indication George's mind raced with questions that had no rational answers. Wild horses might occasionally show curiosity about human objects, but the deliberate delivery of historical artifacts suggested a level of understanding that defied conventional knowledge about equine behavior. As he carefully examined the journal's first pages, the rain began to taper off sunlight, breaking through the clouds. The Mustang remained on the porch, watching George with that same unnerving intelligence. "I need to call someone about this," George muttered, reaching for his cell phone. Then he paused, looking at the wild horse that had somehow bridged the gap between their worlds to deliver this historical treasure. "But first, I think I owe you breakfast." He reached for the bucket of apples and carrots, offering one of each to the Mustang, who accepted them with surprising gentleness as the animal ate. George made a decision that would alter not just his understanding of wild horse intelligence, but potentially rewrite a chapter of local history. "I'm going to call you Rebel," he told the Mustang. "Seems fitting for a horse that doesn't follow the rules." Rebel's ears flickered forward at the sound of his new name, and for a moment George could have sworn the Mustang's eyes held something close to approval. The journal in his hands and the wild horse on his porch represented mysteries that demanded exploration. George Martin, who'd been merely existing since Ruth's death, suddenly found himself with a purpose and an unlikely partner to help him fulfill it. "Well, Rebel," he said quietly, "I think this is the beginning of something extraordinary. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now." Back to the story. Morning light streamed through the kitchen windows as George spread the contents of the saddlebag across his table. After feeding his livestock, he'd returned to examine his mysterious delivery more carefully. The journal map and papers remained where he'd left them, along with a new mug of coffee to replace the one he dropped outside. Rebel grazed peacefully near the fence line, having declined to leave despite the open gate. The Mustang's behavior defied everything George knew about wild horses. "This makes no sense, Max," George told the border collie sitting attentively beside his chair. "Wild Mustangs don't bring people things. They certainly don't stick around." Afterward, Max tilted his head, Looking from his master to the window where Rebel was visible, George carefully opened the journal again, handling the brittle pages with reverence. The handwriting was neat and precise. The mark of an educated man. April 17th, 1887. George read aloud. Having departed Fort Douglas with supplies for a 3-month survey, find myself drawn to investigate local rumors of unusual geological features in the region. Natives call the place of echoing spirits. My official orders are to map potential routes for the new railroad spur, but Colonel Harrison has granted me discretion to explore prospects that might benefit our understanding of this territory. George flipped through several pages of geographical observations and sketches of terrain, before another entry caught his eye. May 3rd, 1887, made camp near an unusual rock formation. The Pute Guide calls Guardian Rock. The natives show great reverence for this area and speak of horses that are more than horses. Their stories suggest these animals possess guardian spirits that protect sacred places. While I attribute such talk to superstition, I must admit, the wild horses in this region display unusual behavior, approaching with curiosity rather than fear. The telephone's ring interrupted George's reading. He closed the journal carefully before answering Martin. Residence, George, it's Howard. Any chance you could stop by the station today? There's someone I'd like you to meet an hour later. George found himself in the sheriff's office in Juniper Springs, the saddlebag secured in his truck he hadn't mentioned it to Howard, yet uncertain how to explain its impossible delivery. The sheriff's office was a modest brick building that housed both law enforcement and, during budget shortfalls, the occasional town meeting. Howard beckoned George into his private office where a woman was examining maps spread across his desk. George, this is Allison Ward. She's a wildlife biologist with the Wild Horse Conservation Center. Allison, George Martin, former veterinarian and one of our most stubborn local ranchers. The woman looked up with a smile in her mid-30s. She had intelligent eyes and a practical ponytail that suggested she spent more time in the field than behind a desk. Mr. Martin, it's good to meet you. Sheriff Cooper says your property borders Liberty. Mesa. George nodded, shaking her offered hand, going on 3 generations now. Allison's here monitoring the Mustang herds. Howard explained the droughts pushing them into new territories. And there's concern about conflicts with residential areas, not to mention the impact of the proposed resort development. Allison added, her expression revealing her position on that issue. That's partly why I wanted you two to meet. Howard said George's land provides a buffer between development zones and protected horse territory, and given your background in veterinary medicine. Former background, George interrupted. I haven't practiced in years. Still, Allison said, local knowledge is invaluable. I've been documenting unusual herd movements since the drought began, and your property sits at a crucial junction point. George hesitated, then decided to take a chance. I've had an unusual visitor at my place, a Mustang. Distinctive dun stallion. White blazed down his face. Allison's interest visibly sharpened. That sounds like the band leader from the northwestern herd. We've been tracking him for months. He's unusually adaptive, finding water sources other Mustangs miss. You've seen him on your property more than seen him. He's been coming to my fence line daily for the past week. George paused, aware how this might sound to a conservationist, giving him apples, carrots, just until the drought breaks. To his surprise, Allison didn't immediately lecture him on interfering with wildlife. Instead, she looked thoughtful. Normally, I'd advise against feeding wild horses, but these are extreme circumstances. The herds are struggling. If you're willing, I'd like to observe him on your property. His band has shown remarkable resilience, and we're trying to understand their survival strategies. After arranging for Allison to visit the following morning, George returned to his truck, the saddlebag hidden beneath his jacket. He wasn't ready to share that development yet, not until he understood more about what was happening as he drove through Juniper Springs. A row of new signs along Main Street caught his attention. Progress brings prosperity and support. Red Rock Resort outside the town's only real estate office, a sleek SUV with corporate logos, stood parked, its pristine surface out of place among the dust-covered local vehicles. George pulled into Miller's General Store for supplies, nodding to familiar faces as he collected feed and groceries at the counter. Jennifer. Miller rang up his purchases with a sympathetic smile. Saw you noticing those new signs. Albert Thornton's people have been all over town this week, talking about jobs and economic revival, and I'm sure they're not mentioning water rights or what happens to the Mustangs. George replied. Jennifer lowered her voice. They're saying the resort will include a wild horse experience where guests can see managed herds, whatever that means. It means corral and photo opportunities, George said grimly. He added extra apples to his order, ignoring Jennifer's knowing look when George returned to Three Pines Farm. Rebel was waiting by the fence line, the Mustang's head lifted at the sound of the truck ears pivoting forward with evident recognition. You're still here, George said, approaching slowly with an apple held flat on his palm. Beginning to think you're not planning to leave, Rebel took the apple delicately, his warm breath ghosting across George's hand. The Mustang's eyes, rimmed with long lashes, held George's gaze with unsettling directness. You've got people wondering about you. George continued, reaching for a second apple. Biologist is coming tomorrow to see you. Try not to disappoint her. After Rebel finished the apples, instead of returning to the Mie as he usually did, he turned and walked along the fence line, stopping. After 30 ft to look back at George when George didn't immediately follow the horse, nickered softly and pawed the ground. You want me to follow you? George asked incredulously. Rebel tossed his head and continued walking, stopping again to look back. George followed along his side of the fence. Curiosity overcoming skepticism, the Mustang led him to the property's northeastern corner, where a cattle gate opened onto public land, a shortcut to Liberty Mesa that George hadn't used in years. Rebel stopped at the gate, looking from it to George with obvious intent. I can't just wander off into protected land, especially not with development talks happening, George explained, feeling only slightly ridiculous for reasoning with a horse. Besides, I've got your saddlebag to figure out. At the mention of the saddlebag, Rebel's ears pricked forward sharply, his attention intensifying. George stared in disbelief. You understand what I'm saying, don't you? The Mustang pawed the ground again, then with seeming reluctance turned and trotted away toward Liberty Mesa, occasionally glancing back as if expecting George to change his mind that evening. George continued examining the journal by lamplight. The windows open to catch the cool desert breeze. The entries detailed Westfield's explorations around what was clearly Liberty Mesa, though place names had changed over the intervening years. May 12, 1887. One entry read, made a significant discovery today that warrants further investigation while following a band of wild horses through a narrow canyon. I was led to what appears to be an abandoned mine entrance. Evidence suggests recent activity despite no recorded claims in this area. More peculiar still was the behavior of the horses, particularly the lead stallion, who seemed deliberately to bring me to this location. George looked up from the journal. The parallel too striking. To ignore a wild stallion leading a human to a discovery in 1887, and again now in his lifetime. The next morning dawned clear, the drought reasserting itself after the brief rain. George was checking irrigation lines when a government-issued SUV pulled into his driveway. Allison Ward stepped out, dressed practically in hiking boots and cargo pants, a camera with a long lens hanging around her neck. Mr. Martin. Good morning. She called. Hope I'm not too early. George is fine. I know I've been up since 5. Coffee's fresh if you want some. While Allison accepted the offered mug, George scanned the horizon for Rebel, but the Mustang wasn't visible. He might not show today, George cautioned. Though he's been pretty regular this past week. That's unusual in itself, Allison said, following George to his porch. Wild Mustangs typically avoid established human settlements, especially during drought, when they're more vulnerable. Makes me wonder if he was perhaps orphaned and hand-raised, then released. Would that explain him bringing things to people? George asked carefully. Allison looked up sharply. What kind of things? Before George could decide how much to reveal, Max began barking excitedly. Both humans turned to see Rebel appearing over a rise, trotting purposefully toward the farm. Extraordinary, Allison breathed, raising her camera. He's coming directly to the house. They watched as Rebel approached his pace, unhurried, but determined. When he reached the fence line, he stopped, studying Allison. With evident curiosity. He's magnificent, she said quietly, snapping photos. Healthy despite the drought, and that blaze marking is distinctive. I've only observed this band from a distance before. George walked slowly to the fence, an apple in his hand. Rebel approached without hesitation. taking the offering gently before turning his attention back to Allison. "He's evaluating me," she said with professional admiration, calculating threat levels. "The cognitive processing is remarkable, would you believe me if I said he brought me something?" George asked, watching her reaction carefully. Allison lowered her camera. "What kind of something?" "Wait here." George returned moments later with the saddlebag. Rebel's reaction was immediate, his ears pricked forward, and he moved closer to the fence, clearly recognizing the object. "Where did you get this?" Allison asked, examining the weathered leather he brought it. George said simply, gesturing to Rebel, "Left it on my doorstep 2 days ago. It contains a journal from 1887 belonging to James Whitfield, the cavalry scout from local legends." Allison looked skeptical. "George, wild horses don't bring people historical artifacts, I know how it sounds, but he literally delivered it to my porch during the rain inside. Is Westfield's journal describing experiences eerily similar to what's happening now?" Rebel nickered softly, drawing their attention. The Mustang was pouring at the ground near the fence post, then turned toward Liberty Mesa, before looking back at them. "He wants to show us something. George said he's been trying to get me to follow him beyond the property line into protected federal land that would require permits, especially with all the development scrutiny right now." Allison bit her lip, clearly torn between protocol and scientific curiosity. "I have permits," she admitted after a moment, "for research purposes." If this were documented as an official observation of unusual Mustang behavior. A vehicle approaching interrupted their conversation. A black luxury SUV with tinted windows rolled up George's driveway, dust billowing behind it. "Thornton," George muttered. Recognizing the vehicle, the SUV stopped and 2 men emerged. The first was young, perhaps mid-20s, wearing business casual attire that looked out of place in the desert setting. The second was older, his tailored suit equally incongruous but worn with the confidence of someone accustomed to imposing his will on his surroundings. "Mr. Martin," the older man called, approaching with a practiced smile. "Albert Thornton, we've corresponded about your property, you mean?" "Those offers I keep throwing away," George replied, not moving from his position by Rebel. If Thornton was offended, he didn't show it. His attention shifted to Allison, then to the Mustang, watching them wearily from the fence line. "Miss Ward, isn't it?" From the Conservation Center, his smile remained fixed. "I wasn't aware you made house calls documenting drought effects on herd behavior," Allison replied neutrally. Thornton gestured to his companion. "This is Ryan Taylor, my project coordinator. We're actually here about the Mustangs. In a way, our environmental impact studies for Red Rock Resort are nearly complete, and we've developed what we believe is an innovative solution to the wild horse question." "There is no wild horse question." George interrupted. "They were here first." Thornton continued smoothly. "Our proposal includes a dedicated conservation area within the resort grounds, managed herds protected from drought and predators visible to guests. A win-win, you mean a zoo?" Allison said flatly. "We prefer natural habitat experience," Ryan offered. Speaking for the first time with educational components, Rebel had backed away from the fence during this exchange, clearly uncomfortable with the newcomers. Now surprisingly, he approached, again dropping something from his mouth before quickly retreating. George moved to the fence, looking down at a small object half buried in the dust. He picked it up, brushing away dirt to reveal a tarnished brass button with a military insignia. Clearly antique, clearly connected to the saddlebag. He pocketed it quickly, but not before Thornton noticed. "Something interesting, just trash." George lied, turning back to the conversation. "Mr. Thornton, I appreciate your visit, but my answer remains the same. 3 Pines Farm isn't for sale. The drought won't break." "Mr. Martin," Thornton said, his affable mask slipping slightly, "this land can't sustain traditional farming much longer. Our offer is extremely generous. Then find someone else who wants your generosity." Thornton handed George a business card. "The town council votes next month on rezoning measures. Things are changing in Dry River. With or without your participation, call me when you're ready to discuss terms." After the SUV departed, George showed Allison the button. "Another delivery," he said quietly. "This is getting stranger by the day." Allison examined the button closely. "Cavalry, late 19th century, consistent with your journal's timeline." She looked up at Rebel, who had returned to the fence line. "I'm officially intrigued." George, if you're serious about wanting to follow him, I can arrange research permits for tomorrow. You believe me now? She handed back the button with a thoughtful expression. Let's say I'm open to possibilities I wouldn't have considered yesterday. Whatever's happening here. It's certainly not typical Mustang behavior after Allison left promising to return early the next morning with permits. George sat on his porch watching Rebel graze peacefully near the fence, showing no inclination to return to his herd. George turned the button over in his hand, remembering something Ruth used to say, when unusual things happen, coincidence is just the universe's way of winking at you. He thought of the journal locked safely in his desk drawer of Whitfield's descriptions of horses that led him to discoveries of the parallel experiences separated by more than a century. What are you trying to show me? He asked quietly. Rebel lifted his head as if hearing the question, his gaze meeting George's across the yard. The Mustang nickered softly, that same distinctive sound that seemed meant specifically for George in that moment. Despite rational skepticism, George became certain of one thing. Whatever mystery had begun with the delivery of the saddlebag, Rebel was intentionally involving him in it. Tomorrow he would follow where the Mustang led, permits or no permits inside the house. The telephone rang. George answered to hear Sheriff Cooper's concerned voice. George thought, you should know Albert Thornton just filed a complaint about trespassing on survey lands. Says he saw you and Allison, Ward, preparing to cross into restricted areas. We never left my property. Howard, I figured as much. Just watch yourself. Thornton's got the mayor and half the council in his pocket, already. He's looking for any leverage he can get after hanging up. George returned to the porch. The sun was setting behind Liberty Mesa, painting the landscape in amber and gold. Rebel remained by the fence, silhouetted against the fading light. We've got complications, George told the Mustang. But I'll follow you. Tomorrow, one way or another, as if understanding. Rebel tossed his head mane, catching the last rays of sunlight, then turned toward Liberty Mesa with a clear invitation in his stance. Whatever waited in those hills had been patient for 130 years. It could wait one more night. Dawn painted the eastern sky in watercolor hues. As George filled his canteen, the temperature would climb past 90 before noon, making an early start essential for their expedition. He packed Whitfield's journal in a waterproof bag along with the brass button and basic supplies for a day hike. Max watched expectantly from the porch steps. Not today, boy, George told him, feeling a pang of guilt at the dog's disappointed whine. Someone needs to watch the place. Allison's government SUV arrived precisely at 6:30 a.m., dust billowing behind it. She emerged wearing a wide-brimmed hat, her backpack looking considerably more professional than George's weathered Dayak. Brought the permits, she said, waving. A folder official research expedition. Even if we encounter Thornton surveyors, they can't legally interfere. Unbreakable? George asked. Scanning the horizon, Allison smiled. Already waiting by the northeast gate, I spotted him on my way in. Sure enough, the dun stallion stood patiently at the boundary of George's property, as if he understood their plans. Perfectly, when they approached, permit secured in Allison's backpack. Rebel nickered in greeting, focusing particularly on George. He recognizes you, Allison observed, making notes in a small field book. That's consistent behavior. Establishing you as a trusted individual still doesn't explain how he found a 130-year-old saddlebag. George replied, opening the gate, or why he brought it to me. Specifically, one mystery at a time, Allison said pragmatically. Right now I'm documenting unprecedented, wild Mustang behavior. The historical angle is secondary as they stepped through the gate onto public land. Rebel moved ahead, stopping periodically to ensure they followed his path. Led directly toward Liberty Mesa, his ears occasionally flicking, back to verify their continued presence. He's leading us, Allison murmured, taking photographs. Not just allowing us to follow, but actively guiding. That's intentional behavior. The terrain grew more challenging as they approached the mesa's foothills. Rebel navigated confidently, selecting paths accessible to humans while avoiding dead ends. An hour into their journey, they entered a narrow canyon George had never explored. Despite its proximity to his property, the topography creates a natural blind spot. He realized aloud, from my land, this canyon entrance isn't visible at all. Allison consulted her GPS. We're entering a section that's been proposed for the first phase of resort development. Interesting timing. Rebel paused at the canyon mouth, waiting until they drew closer before proceeding. The passage narrowed walls of striated red rock rising on either side. Despite the early hour, heat reflected intensely from the stone surfaces. Whitfield mentioned a canyon in his journal. George said, wiping perspiration from his forehead, led there by wild horses, just like we're being led. Now science requires skepticism. Allison reminded him, though her expression had softened from her initial disbelief. But I admit this behavior is remarkable. My colleagues will struggle to accept my report without video evidence, which is why you brought this. George nodded toward her backpack, where a small camera was mounted. On a shoulder strap recording their journey, the canyon floor sloped upward, becoming steeper as they proceeded. Rebel maintained a deliberate pace, occasionally looking back to ensure they managed the terrain. After navigating a particularly challenging section, the passage opened suddenly into a hidden valley invisible from the surrounding landscape. My God. Allison breathed, taking in the unexpected verdant space. Unlike the drought-stricken land surrounding it, this valley held patches of green, vegetation, and most surprisingly, a small spring, emerging from rocks at its center, creating a modest pool before disappearing underground again. A hidden water source. George realized this explains how Rebel's herd survived the drought better than others. The Mustangs know this place. Allison agreed, photographing the oasis, but they've never brought other researchers here. The real question is, why lead you now? Her question was answered as Rebel moved purposefully toward the rock formation from which the spring emerged, standing nearly 20 feet tall. The unusual stone structure resembled a sentinel overlooking the valley guardian rock. George whispered, recognizing the formation from Whitfield's description. This is exactly what he wrote about. Rebel stopped at the base of the formation, pouring the ground with evident purpose. As George and Allison approached, their attention was drawn to markings on the rock, face weathered by time but unmistakably human-made petroglyphs. Allison said, her scientific demeanor giving way to wonder. Much older than Whitfield's era, the ancient images depicted horses and human figures arranged in patterns suggesting narrative, rather than simple representation. One section showed horses leading humans to what appeared to be a mountain opening. Look familiar? George asked quietly. Rebel nickered softly, drawing their attention back to where he stood. The Mustang was indicating a specific area at the rock's base with his hoof. He wants us to look here, Allison said. Kneeling carefully together, they glared away, loose soil and vegetation, revealing more petroglyphs hidden by time and overgrowth. These images were more detailed, showing horses carrying objects to human settlements. This changes everything, Allison murmured, photographing each section methodically. These aren't just random images. They're telling a story of cooperation between wild horses and humans long before European settlement, just like what's happening now, George said, looking at Rebel with newfound appreciation. The Mustang watched them work with evident patience, occasionally moving to indicate other areas that warranted investigation. By midday, they had documented extensive pictographic panels showing a relationship between humans and wild horses, unlike anything in conventional historical records. We need an expert to interpret these properly, Allison said as they rested in the shade, sharing water and trail food. Someone with knowledge of indigenous history in this region. Ernest walks far. George suggested. He's an elder who lives just outside Juniper Springs. Ruth used to consult him about native plants for her garden. Rebel had moved to the spring, drinking deeply, before returning to stand nearby, clearly not finished with his mission. After their brief rest, he led them around Guardian Rock, to its western face, where the terrain sloped downward. There's something here he wants us to see, George said, following closely, partially obscured by erosion and overgrowth. A dark opening became visible in the rock face, the entrance to what appeared to be a small cave or mine-haft. Timber supports, weathered almost to dust, framed the opening. This matches Whitfield's description exactly, George confirmed, pulling out the journal and reading. The stallion led me to what appears to be an abandoned mine entrance, evidence suggesting recent activity. Despite no recorded claims, Allison approached cautiously, examining the entrance without. Entering this is beyond my expertise. We'd need proper equipment and permits for underground exploration. Rebel watched from several yards away, his duty apparently fulfilled for now, when George photographed the entrance with Allison's camera. The Mustang approached Guardian Rock again, drawing their attention to something they'd missed. Faint lettering carved into the stone near the cave entrance. JW 187. George read, tracing the weathered inscription with his fingertips. James Westfield was here right where we're standing. The historical implications are significant, Allison said, her professional composure returning. Despite her evident excitement, this could explain Westfield's disappearance and why Rebel brought you the saddle bag, but not how a wild Mustang and knew where to find it. After 130 years, George pointed out, or why bring it specifically to me? Their return journey began as afternoon temperatures peaked. Rebel led them back through the canyon, selecting a slightly different route that proved easier to navigate at the boundary of George's property. The Mustang stopped, looking from them to Liberty Mesa and back again. Will you come back tomorrow? George asked, feeling only slightly foolish for addressing the horse directly. Rebel nickered softly in what seemed like affirmation, then turned and trotted away toward the mesa, his mission complete for the day. I've never seen anything like this, Allison admitted as they walked the final stretch to George's farm. In 20 years of studying wild horses, I've never observed behavior that approaches this level of apparent intentionality. We need to speak with Ernest Walks. Far George decided, and someone from the Historical Society, about Westfield's journal. We should also be careful how we proceed. Allison cautioned, if word gets out about archaeological findings on land slated for development, it could complicate matters or accelerate Thornton's timeline before preservation orders can be implemented. They parted with plans to meet the following afternoon with Ernest, whom George would contact as Allison's SUV disappeared down the dusty road. George stood on his porch, turning the cavalry button in his palm. Thoughtfully, the telephone rang inside, drawing him from his contemplation. George Martin, Diana Wells from the Juniper Springs Gazette. I understand you've had some unusual visits from a wild Mustang recently. George silently cursed small-town gossip networks, who told you that Jennifer, at the general store, mentioned you've been buying extra apples. Then Sheriff Cooper's daughter mentioned Ms. Ward from the Conservation Center has been visiting your property. I'm working on a piece about drought impacts on wildlife care to comment. George hesitated, weighing the potential benefits and risks of publicity. Why don't you come out tomorrow afternoon around 4? There might be a story worth telling. After hinging up, he called Nest Walks Far, arranging for the elder to join them the following day. Then he spent the evening studying Westfield's journal more carefully, cross-referencing entries with their discoveries. One passage stood out. May 20th, 1887. The Paiute guide has abandoned our expedition, claiming the horses have shown warning signs of coming danger. He insists this valley is sacred ground where messenger horses communicate between worlds. While I dismiss such superstitions, I cannot explain the stallion's behavior, repeatedly bringing small objects to my camp and attempting to lead me northward away from the cave system. George looked up from the journal, struck by the parallels. Westfield had also received objects from a Mustang just before his disappearance. The next afternoon brought a gathering unlike any Three Pines farm had hosted in years. Allison arrived first, followed by Nest Walks Far, an elderly man whose deeply lined face reflected decades of desert sun. Despite his 83 years, he moved with surprising agility, his keen eyes missing nothing. The land remembers even when people forget, he observed cryptically after hearing George's account. Some stories wait generations to be told. Diana Wells arrived precisely at 4, her compact car raising dust clouds visible long before she reached the house. In her mid-40s, with prematurely silver hair, she carried herself with the confident efficiency of a journalist who'd conducted countless interviews. So where's this famous Mustang? She asked after introductions. Notebook already open, as if on cue, Rebel appeared on the ridge, overlooking the farm, silhouetted against the afternoon sky. All conversation ceased as he descended toward them, moving with deliberate dignity. Remarkable timing, Diana murmured, her journalistic skepticism visibly wavering. He's been doing that, George said quietly, showing up exactly when needed. Ernest Walks Far watched the Mustangs approach with particular intensity. This one carries old knowledge, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The markings match the ancient stories. Rebel stopped at the fence line, focusing immediately on Nest, rather than George, as if recognizing the elder's significance. The Mustang's attention then shifted to the saddlebag George had brought outside, laid open on the porch table. You should show him what you found. Ernest suggested the valley and the rock paintings when George described Guardian Rock and the petroglyphs. Ernest nodded slowly. The place of echoing spirit, sacred ground in our stories. The paintings show messenger horses who carried wisdom between worlds. Diana was writing rapidly, her initial skepticism replaced by professional interest. Are you suggesting some cultural tradition? Involving wild horses has continued unbroken for centuries, not unbroken. Ernest corrected, forgotten. Then remembered when needed. The horses never forgot their purpose, even when humans did rebel. Approached the fence, allowing Ernest to extend a weathered hand toward him. The first person besides George the Mustang had permitted to come so close. He's chosen you to receive this message. Ernest told George, there's purpose in that choice. But why me? George asked the question that had haunted him since the saddle's arrival. Ernest's gaze was direct. The land remembers. Perhaps you were already connected to this story without knowing it. Diana requested permission to photograph Rebel, which the Mustang tolerated with surprising patience. This could be significant beyond local interest. She told George, mind if I contact some colleagues at regional papers? Actually, Allison interjected cautiously. We should consider the implications of publicity. There are development interests targeting this exact area. Albert Thornton's resort project. Diana nodded. All the more reason for public awareness. Wouldn't you say historical and archaeological findings could trigger preservation reviews, or prompt them to accelerate destruction before such reviews occur? George pointed out as the discussion continued. Rebel grew restless, moving along the fence line with evident purpose. George followed, aware the others were watching with varying degrees of curiosity. What is it? He asked quietly. When they were beyond earshot of the others, Rebel poured. The ground then turned deliberately toward Liberty Mesa, looking back at George with clear intention. You want me to come now with everyone here? The Mustang's response was to pour the ground again, more urgently. Something's changed. George realized. Something at the sight. He returned to the group, explaining Rebel's apparent urgency. Ernest nodded gravely. The messenger believes time is short. You should listen. I can have my equipment ready in 15 minutes. Allison offered immediately. I'm coming, too, Diana stated, rather than ask. This is too important to miss. George looked to Nest, who shook his head slightly. My old legs won't manage that journey today. But I will speak with the tribal council about what you found. The paintings must be documented properly by our people. As they prepared for an unexpected second expedition, George felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced since Ruth's illness. The mystery that had begun with an apple offered to a hungry wild horse had become something more significant, not just to him but potentially to the region's historical record and the survival of the Mustangs themselves. Let's follow where he leads, George said, watching Rebel waiting patiently by the gate, whatever Whitfield found. Over a century ago, I think it's time the full story was told. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Liberty Mesa as George, Allison, and Diana followed Rebel through the canyon. Diana struggled occasionally with the terrain, her city shoes unsuited for the rocky path, but her determination never wavered. I'm beginning to understand why you were reluctant to share this story, she admitted, pausing to catch her breath. If I weren't seeing it myself, you'd assume we were exaggerating or hallucinating. Allison finished with a wry smile. Trust me. My first scientific instinct was extreme skepticism. Rebel maintained a brisk pace, his urgency unmistakable. Unlike their measured exploration that morning, the Mustang now led them directly toward Guardian Rock, with minimal stops. He's definitely anxious about something, George observed as they entered the hidden valley. The reason became clear immediately near the spring. Bright orange survey stakes had been placed in a grid pattern. Plastic ribbons marked with property of Thornton Enterprises fluttered in the afternoon breeze. They've already started preliminary site work, Allison said, her expression darkening without proper archaeological assessment. Diana pulled out her camera, documenting the stakes. That's potentially illegal if there are historical artifacts present. Rebel bypassed the spring entirely, heading straight for Guardian Rock. At the base of the formation, he poured insistently, at an area they hadn't examined before, a section of the rock face partially obscured by overgrown sagebrush. "He wants us to look here," George said. Kneeling to clear away the vegetation together, they revealed what appeared to be a small opening in the rock no more than 2 feet high, nearly invisible unless one knew exactly where to look. "Is that a cave entrance?" Diana asked, crouching. For a better view, Allison shone her flashlight into the opening. "It's some kind of chamber, definitely not natural. The edges are too regular." George examined the surrounding rock face, finding faint tool marks. Someone he carved this deliberately, then disguised it. Rebel nickered softly, moving back to give them space while maintaining his watchful presence. The Mustang's behavior suggested he'd achieved his immediate goal by bringing them to this discovery. "I can squeeze through," Allison offered, already removing her backpack. "I've done cave research before." "Wait," George cautioned, "we should document the exterior first in case Thornton's people return and destroy evidence." Diana photographed the entrance while Allison sketched its location relative to other features. George carefully examined the surrounding area, finding what appeared to be deliberate markings near the opening. A small, weathered carving of a horse. "It's like a signature," he said, tracing the outline, gently, or a key. Once they'd thoroughly documented the exterior, Allison prepared to enter the chamber, securing a rope around her waist, with George holding the other end. "Just a preliminary assessment." She reminded them no artifact removal until proper authorities are involved. She slipped headfirst into the narrow opening, her slender frame barely fitting through for several tense minutes. George and Diana waited, the only sound Rebel's occasional soft nickering. "There's a small chamber." Allison's voice emerged, slightly muffled, about 8 feet square. "And George, there's something here, several somethings. Can you describe them?" He called back. "A leather case, looks military, some tools, papers in a metal box, all old, very old, and there's writing on the wall carved into the stone, JW waits at Eagle's Height. That mean anything to you?" "Not yet," George replied, "but Eagle's Height might be a place name from Westfield's era." Allison emerged minutes later, dust covering her clothing, but excitement evident in her expression. "It's definitely a deliberately created cache. Someone hid those items with the intention of returning for them." Westfield, George concluded, he must have hidden his discoveries here before his disappearance. But how would Rebel know about it? Diana asked the question. They were all considering that chamber has been sealed for over a century. They had no answer. Only the Mustang's steady gaze meeting theirs, with what seemed like ancient patience. After documenting the chamber's contents with photographs taken through the opening, they replaced the covering vegetation, camouflaging it from casual discovery. The survey stakes presented a more complicated problem. If we remove them, Thornton will just send people to replace them, Allison reasoned, and they'll know someone's been here. Let them. Diana replied, her journalistic instincts engaged. My story goes to print tomorrow. By the time they return, there will be public awareness of potential historical significance. As they prepared to leave, Rebel approached the spring, drinking deeply before returning to escort them out of the valley. The Mustang's behavior continued to defy conventional understanding, leading them through the canyon with purpose and awareness. Back at Three Pines Farm, Ernest Waxfar waited on the porch, somehow knowing they would return with significant news as they described the hidden chamber and its contents. The elder nodded slowly. The stories speak of such places, he confirmed, sacred caches where important tribal knowledge was preserved during times of persecution. If Westfield found such a site, he might have been trying to protect it. George finished thinking of the journal entries describing the scouts' growing respect for native traditions or exploit it. Diana suggested pragmatically gold was still the primary motivator for many in that era. Ernest considered this possibility. The true history may lie somewhere between, but the messenger horse has chosen to reveal it now. When both the land and the wild ones face threat, Diana departed with promises of a front-page story, while Allison made calls to archaeological authorities who could properly excavate the chamber. Ernest remained speaking at length with George about tribal history connected to Liberty Mesa. The place of echoing spirits was important to my people for generations, he explained, not just for the water, but because there, it was said, horses would speak wisdom to those who learned to listen. And what happened to change that? George asked Ernest. Expression grew solemn. The cavalry happened miners seeking gold, the usual story of our lands, but the specific history of Westfield and why he vanished, that remains untold until now. That evening, after Ernest and Allison had departed, George sat on his porch watching the sunset paint Liberty Mesa in gold and crimson. Rebel remained at the fence line, having declined to return to his herd despite the approaching night. "Why me?" George asked the Mustang directly. "Of all the people who could have found Westfield saddle egg, why bring it to me?" Rebel offered no answer except his steady presence, a silent companion as darkness fell. The following morning, Diana's article appeared under the headline, "World Mustang Leads Locals to Historic Discovery." The piece was measured and factual, focusing on the archaeological significance, while noting the coincidental timing with Thornton's development plans by noon. George's phone hadn't stopped ringing calls from regional newspapers, television stations, even a national magazine interested in the story. He directed inquiries to Allison's research center, maintaining a cautious distance from the growing media attention. Shortly after lunch, a familiar black SUV rolled up his driveway. This time Albert Thornton emerged alone, his usual polished demeanor showing signs of strain. "Mr. Martin," he began without preamble, "this publicity stunt with the horse is clever, I'll grant you that." "Not a stunt," George replied calmly. "Just reporting facts. Facts selectively chosen to interfere with legitimate business development." Thornton countered, "Archaeological reviews can delay projects for years, as I'm sure you're aware. If there's historical significance to that land, the public deserves to know before luxury condos are built over it." Thornton's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm prepared to double my previous offer for your property right now." "Cash deal." George's eyebrows raised. Despite himself, the figure would solve every financial problem he'd faced since Ruth's medical bills had drained their savings. It would fund a comfortable retirement anywhere he chose. Why the sudden generosity, he asked instead. "Let's call it expedience. Your cooperation would simplify matters, and if I sold to you, I'm guessing any testimony about Mustangs delivering historical artifacts would no longer be considered credible." Thornton's silence confirmed George's suspicion. "The offer remains open for 48 hours. Thornton finally said, handing George an envelope. "I suggest you consider your future carefully. Mr. Martin, drought conditions aren't improving. This farm won't sustain you much longer." After Thornton departed, George opened the envelope, staring at the figure that represented more money than he'd ever expected to see. The practical voice in his head, the one that had grown louder since Ruth's death, urged him to accept. But something stronger held him back, a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for too long. Tease. Telephone rang again. This time, it was Sheriff Cooper. "George, thought you should know Thornton's surveying crew is back at Liberty Mesa with equipment they're claiming. They have permits for preliminary ground testing that can't be legal with an archaeological review pending. There's a loophole they're exploiting, just soil testing, supposedly not disturbing any potential artifacts. I'm heading out there myself to monitor." George immediately called Allison, who was already en route to the site with a team from State University. Within 30 minutes, George joined a growing assemblage at the canyon entrance. Allison and 2 archaeologists, Sheriff Cooper, Diana Wells, with a photographer and several tribal representatives Ernest had contacted. Thornton's crew faced with unexpected witnesses and cameras maintained they were simply collecting soil samples as permitted their presence so close to Guardian Rock. However, suggested more urgent objectives. Ryan Taylor, Thornton's assistant, approached George at the perimeter. Unlike his employer, the younger man's discomfort was evident. "This isn't what I signed up for," he said quietly, glancing back at his colleagues. "There's something you should know. Thornton has known about the Westfield connection for months. The corporation commissioned a historical survey last year that identified potential artifacts in this area. They knew and didn't report it." George asked. Understanding the legal music implications, Ryan nodded. "There's a private collection of documentation in the project office maps showing what they call avoidance areas, places to develop around without triggering formal reviews." "Why tell me this?" "Because I grew up in Juniper Springs." Ryan admitted, "My grandfather used to tell stories about messenger horses and sacred places. I thought they were just legends, until I saw your Mustang on the news this morning." Their conversation was interrupted by sudden commotion as Rebel appeared on the ridge above, silhouetted dramatically against the sky. The Mustang wasn't alone behind him. His entire band watched from the ridgeline, an impressive display of equine solidarity. "My God," Diana breathed, her photographer capturing the moment. "It's like they know Rebel descended alone, moving with deliberate dignity toward the gathered humans." The surveying crew stopped working, their expressions ranging from confusion to awe as the Mustang approached. Sheriff Cooper stepped forward, addressing the crew foreman. "They think we need to pause operations until we clarify some jurisdictional questions, especially in light of new information about prior knowledge of historical significance." As authorities negotiated, Rebel approached George Nickering, softly in greeting before turning his attention to Allison and the archaeologists. The Mustang's intentional behavior was unmistakable even to skeptics. "He's showing consciousness of the situation," one of the archaeologists murmured, documenting the behavior on video. "This is extraordinary." With the survey crew temporarily suspended, Allison's team began a proper assessment of the hidden chamber using specialized equipment they captured, images of the interior without disturbing the contents. "There's a journal in there," the lead archaeologist confirmed, examining the digital images and what appears to be geological surveys, potentially significant historical documentation. By late afternoon, representatives from the State Historical Preservation Office had arrived, bringing formal orders to halt all development activities pending review. Thon's crew departed reluctantly, leaving the archaeologists to establish a proper excavation protocol as activity centered around Guardian Rock. George found a quiet moment. With Allison away from the growing crowd, Ryan Taylor shared something interesting. He told her, recounting the assistant's revelation about Thornton's prior knowledge that could change everything legally. Allison replied, "Deliberate concealment of historical artifacts is a serious offense. What happens now?" George asked, watching. "The archaeologist's work, a thorough excavation, proper documentation. If the site qualifies for historical designation, it could receive protected status." She paused, looking toward Liberty Mesa, where Rebel's herd remained visible on the ridge and, hopefully, recognition of the Mustang's traditional territory. Rebel approached them, having maintained a watchful presence throughout the day's developments. The Mustang seemed content with the unfolding events, his mission apparently progressing. "As intended, I still don't understand why he chose me," George admitted, offering an apple to the horse. "Of all the people who could have found Westfield's artifacts." "Perhaps because you were willing to listen," Allison suggested. "Or perhaps because of your connection to this land. 3 generations of your family have boarded this territory, living alongside these horses. Ruth would have loved this," George said softly. She always believed there was something special about the Mustang, said they had old souls. As evening approached, most of the crowd dispersed, leaving only essential personnel to secure the site. Overnight, George prepared to return to his farm, aware that tomorrow would bring new challenges as Thornton inevitably fought the preservation. Music efforts. Rebel accompanied him to the canyon entrance, then stopped, looking back toward Guardian Rock with evident intention. "There's more, isn't there?" George asked. "Something else you want me to understand?" The Mustang's steady gaze held his for a long moment, before the horse turned and trotted back toward the archaeological site, disappearing around a bend in the canyon. George watched him go, certain now that the story beginning to unfold was far larger than a simple historical discovery. Whatever message Rebel was delivering, it connected past and present in ways that might determine the future of Liberty Mesa, and perhaps the wild Mustangs themselves. As he drove home under a sky blazing with sunset colors, George felt more alive than he had in years. The grief that had defined him since Ruth's death hadn't disappeared, but alongside it grew something new: purpose. The mystery Rebel had brought to his doorstep now gave his life direction and meaning beyond mere survival. Tomorrow would bring new revelations. For tonight, that was enough. Sunrise illuminated a transformed landscape around Guardian Rock. What had been an isolated archaeological curiosity 2 days earlier now resembled a professional excavation site. White canopies protected the hidden chamber from elements, while researchers in khaki clothing meticulously documented each discovery. Yellow tape marked a perimeter beyond which a small crowd of observers had gathered: journalists, local residents, and the curious drawn by growing media coverage. George arrived early, thermos of coffee in hand, nodding to security personnel, who now recognized him as a central figure in the unfolding story. Dr. Lauren Adams, the lead archaeologist from State University, waved him toward the main canopy where Allison was already reviewing photographic evidence. Good timing. Dr. Adams greeted him. We're about to remove the journal from the chamber. Given your connection to the initial discovery, we thought you should be present. George watched as two preservation specialists emerged from the chamber, carefully carrying a sealed container inside. Visible through clear archival material lay a leather-bound journal nearly identical to the one Rebel had delivered to his porch. Westfield's second journal, Dr. Adams confirmed from initial examination, it appears to cover the period immediately before his disappearance. With painstaking care, a conservator opened the journal to its first legible page, revealing neat handwriting similar to the earlier volume. Dr. Adams read aloud, June 10, 1887. I can no longer in good conscience continue my assignment as originally instructed. What I have discovered here is not merely a geological curiosity, but evidence of systematic deception concerning territorial boundaries. The native claims to this land are supported by documentation predating current treaties information. Certain interests would prefer remained buried. Allison's expression tightened. He was discovering evidence of land theft, a common story in Western expansion. Dr. Adams agreed grimly, but uncommon to have contemporary documentation from someone within the military structure. Further pages revealed Westfield's growing alliance with local tribes to protect sacred sites from mining interests. The same sites now threatened by Thornton's development. Most significantly, the journal detailed how Westfield had compiled evidence in multiple locations, anticipating attempts to silence him. He created a historical insurance policy, George observed, scattered evidence in different locations with the Mustangs somehow involved in marking these places. By mid-morning, the excavation had yielded additional treasures, geological surveys showing significant gold deposits, official military correspondence, ordering Westfield to ignore native land claims, and most damning, a map. With boundaries clearly altered from earlier versions, this would have been explosive if released in 1887. Dr. Adams explained, it proves government agents deliberately falsified boundaries to exclude mineral-rich lands from protected territories. The documentation painted a picture of Westfield as an unlikely ally to native tribes, a military man whose conscience ultimately outweighed his orders. His final journal entries suggested he planned to deliver evidence to authorities in Salt Lake City, a journey he apparently never completed as the research team cataloged these findings. A commotion at the perimeter drew attention. Albert Thornton had arrived with his legal team and a county official bearing documents they filed for an emergency injunction. Sheriff Cooper explained, joining George and Allison, claiming trespassing and interference with permitted development activities on what grounds Allison demanded. The Historical Preservation Office has already initiated review proceedings. Thornton's arguing the artifacts were planted as part of an orchestrated attempt to block legitimate development. The sheriff looked uncomfortable, and his lawyers are specifically questioning the horse delivery aspect of the initial discovery. George's jaw tightened. They're saying we fabricated the whole thing. The confrontation remained at the perimeter, with preservation officials refusing site access, until a judge ruled on the conflicting claims. Thornton, impeccably dressed despite the desert setting, projected confident authority as reporters gathered around him. While we respect genuine historical preservation, he told the assembled media, we cannot allow unfounded claims to delay economic development that will benefit the entire region. The timing and nature of these supposed discoveries raised serious questions about their authenticity. A voice from the crowd challenged him. What about the Mustang that delivered the saddlebag? Dozens of people have witnessed its unusual behavior. Thornton smiled indulgently. I believe Mr. Martin's Mustang is indeed remarkably well trained. The American Southwest has a long tradition of performance animals in tourist attractions. The insinuation that Rebel was a trained prop rather than a wild Mustang drew murmurs from the crowd before George could respond. Another arrival created a fresh stir. A sleek rental car from which emerged a man in an expensive suit completely unsuited to the desert environment. George stared in disbelief. Peter, his estranged son, approached, looking uncomfortable amid the dust and commotion at 38. Peter Martin carried himself with the rigid posture of someone accustomed to corporate boardrooms rather than open landscapes. Dad, he acknowledged stiffly. Imagine my surprise seeing you on national news this morning, something about a horse, messenger and buried treasure. What are you doing here? George asked, genuinely confused by his son's unexpected appearance. CNN was running the story in the airport lounge. Thought I should see what you've gotten yourself into. Peter surveyed the archaeological activity. With evident skepticism, though I didn't expect quite this circus before they could continue their awkward reunion. Diana Wells approached with her photographer George. We need your comment on Thornton's allegations. Unbreakable, is he here today as, if summoned by his name? A familiar silhouette appeared on the ridgeline above the canyon. Rebel stood watching the activity below his presence, immediately drawing attention from the crowd. Cameras turned upward as the Mustang descended with deliberate dignity, bypassing the security perimeter as if it didn't exist. There's your answer, George told Diana, gesturing toward the approaching horse. Does that look like a trained performance animal to you? Peter watched in evident amazement as Rebel moved directly to George, ignoring the cameras and commotion surrounding them. The Mustang's wild nature was unmistakable in his movement and bearing nothing like the rehearsed behaviors of trained horses. What happened next silenced even the skeptics. Rebel approached Dr. Adams where she stood, examining artifacts, focusing intently on the recovered journal. The Mustang nickered softly, drawing her attention, then deliberately poured at the ground near her feet. The archaeologist looked down, then carefully brushed away surface soil to reveal something partially buried, a tarnished metal object that had been invisible moments before. It's a military medallion, she announced, carefully excavating the item without touching it directly. Cavalry, issue from Westfield's era. As spectators pressed forward to witness this extraordinary moment, Ryan Taylor emerged from the crowd, approaching George with evident purpose. I've brought something you need to see, he said quietly, handing over a USB drive. Internal documents, proving Thornton knew about the historical significance months ago. There's a geological survey that specifically identifies this site as having both historical and mineral value. You're risking your job. George observed. Ryan looked toward Rebel, who was now allowing Dr. Adams to document his behavior on video. Some things matter more than careers. While the archaeological team examined the newly discovered medallion, George brought Allison Sheriff. Cooper and Dr. Adams aside to review Ryan's evidence. The files revealed a systematic effort by Thornton Enterprises to develop around historically significant areas without triggering formal reviews, with specific mention of avoiding Native American complications. This proves prior knowledge and deliberate concealment. Dr. Adams concluded legally actionable under preservation statutes. Thornton, observing their huddle from the perimeter, made a call on his cell phone. Within minutes, an aide approached. Allison, with news that wiped the triumph from her face. What's wrong? George asked as she rejoined them. My research sense primary funding grant is suddenly under review, she said tightly. A corporate foundation with connections to Thornton Enterprises is threatening to withdraw support over research methodology concerns. They're trying to discredit you professionally, George realized, and it might work without that funding our conservation programs for the Mustangs would collapse. The pressure tactics continued throughout the day. Diana's editor called to inform her that Thornton's lawyers had demanded a retraction of her initial article threatening a defamation lawsuit. Even Sheriff Cooper received thinly veiled warnings about county budget implications. If the disorder around the archaeological site continued by afternoon, earnest walks arrived with tribal elders who had been consulting on the petroglyphs. Their presence lent additional gravity to the proceedings as they conducted a brief ceremony acknowledging the sacred nature of the site. We have completed our interpretation of the rock writings, Ernest announced afterward. They tell of an ancient agreement between our people and the horse nations. The Mustangs would guard sacred knowledge in times of danger, revealing it when the time was right, through special messenger horses born with marking signs like Rebel's blaze pattern. George observed. Ernest nodded, the white mark of wisdom. Our stories call it. Such horses were considered bridges between human understanding and nature's knowledge. Peter had been observing these developments, with increasing discomfort, finally pulling George aside near the excavation perimeter. Dad, this is getting out of hand, he said in a low voice. Thorne's people approached me with a private offer. They'll drop all legal challenges and pay a premium price for both your land and rights to this archaeological material. You'd be financially secure for life. George studied his son, seeing Ruth's eyes in a face otherwise shaped by ambition and city living. Did you tell them you don't own my farm? That we've barely spoken in 3 years? Peter had the grace to look embarrassed. I told them I'd discuss options with you. They're offering a reasonable compromise. The resort development would include a historical center featuring the artifacts and special conservation areas for the wild horses controlled and commercialized. George translated the Mustangs in display, paddocks the artifacts in glass cases, telling whatever story fits their marketing. It's better than years of legal battles you can't afford to fight. Peter argued, be practical for once. Mom would have wanted security for your future. The mention of Ruth struck George like a physical blow. Don't tell me what your mother I would have wanted. She understood something you never did, that some things matter more than money. Their conversation was interrupted by Allison, who approached with new urgency. George, you need to see this. The medallion Rebel uncovered. There's an inscription. The conservators had carefully cleaned the tarnished metal, revealing engraved words on its reverse to JW from Chief TR. Truth above orders. 1887 TR would be Thomas Running Elk. Ernest confirmed, examining the medallion in its protective casing, a respected leader who worked with sympathetic whites to document land boundaries. This proves Whitfield had formed an alliance with tribal authorities. The implications were significant, strengthening the historical importance of the discoveries. Yet even as the archaeological team celebrated this connection, Thornton's legal representatives were distributing press statements questioning the find's authenticity and the motivations behind the excavation. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Thornton himself approached George, maintaining a careful distance from the media presence. This has escalated beyond what either of us intended, he offered in a reasonable tone. Perhaps we can find middle ground that respects both progress and preservation. What exactly are you proposing? George asked wearily. A jointly managed historical district. Your property would remain yours with conservation easements properly compensated. The archaeological site would be professionally preserved within the resort boundaries, with appropriate recognition of all contributing parties, including yourself. The offer sounded reasonable on its surface, certainly more conciliatory than Thornton's previous position, yet something in the developer too carefully neutral expression raised George's suspicions. And the Mustangs, what happens to them? And their range, a dedicated conservation area professionally managed. The herd would become a featured attraction, properly protected and sustained, properly corralled, you mean? George translated no longer. Wild. Thornton shrugged slightly. Wild spaces are luxuries in the modern world, Mr. Martin managed. Conservation is the realistic alternative to extinction. Before George could respond, Rebel approached, positioning himself between them with unmistakable intent. The Mustang's ears flattened slightly as he regarded Thornton, who stepped back instinctively. Your equine friend seems to have opinions on negotiation terms, Thornton observed, attempting to mask his discomfort with humor. Rebel turned to George, nickering softly, before looking toward Liberty Mesa, then back again. The same communicative gesture he'd employed since their first encounter. He still has something to show us, George realized aloud. Something beyond what we've found already, as Thornton departed with promises of formal proposal documents. The following day, George gathered Allison, Dr. Adams, and Ernest to discuss this music development. Thornton's offering appears generous because he knows something we don't, Allison reasoned. The timing is suspicious, just as we're uncovering documentation of historical land theft. He suddenly wants a partnership. The geological surveys Ryan provided mention mineral deposits beyond the historical features, Dr. Adams added. Perhaps there's more to this land's value than resort development. Ernest's weathered face reflected generations of experience with broken promises. When those who have taken much suddenly offer to share little, look closely at what they still keep for themselves as they conferred. Peter approached with increasing frustration. You're actually considering refusing a multi-million-dollar settlement offer over a wild horse's behavior. Dad, listen to yourself. George watched Rebel grazing peacefully nearby, the Mustang's presence a counterpoint to the human conflict swirling around him in 3 short weeks. This extraordinary animal had transformed George's understanding of both history and purpose, awakening something he'd thought died with Ruth, the capacity to believe in improbable wonders. "I'm listening to more than myself," George told his son quietly. "I'm listening to what this land and its history are trying to tell us. Maybe it's time you did the same." The setting sun cast guardian rock in amber light, illuminating the ancient petroglyphs that had waited so long to be rediscovered. Whatever Thornton's true motivations, whatever challenges lay ahead, George knew with absolute certainty that Rebel's story wasn't finished. The final pieces of Westfield's legacy remained to be revealed, and somehow the wild Mustang knew exactly where to find them. Dawn mist clung to Liberty Mesa as an unusual procession. Assembled at the base of Guardian Rock, George stood beside Dr. Adams and Allison, reviewing topographical maps spread across a folding table. Sheriff Cooper conferred with state officers who had arrived overnight after reviewing Ryan's evidence. Ernest and tribal elders prepared for the day's expedition with a brief ceremony, their quiet chants carrying through the morning stillness. Most surprising was Peter's presence, now dressed in borrowed jeans and hiking boots that made him look oddly vulnerable, stripped of his corporate armor eagle's height. Dr. Adams pointed to an elevated plateau 2 ME from their current position. It doesn't appear on modern maps under that name, but comparing Westfield's notations with current topography, this has to be the location he referenced, and you believe there's another cache there? Peter asked, his skepticism tempered by the evidence he'd witnessed the previous day. Westfield created multiple information caches as insurance. George explained the journal explicitly mentions Eagle's Height as containing final documentation. Too dangerous to leave unsealed, the gathered group fell silent as Rebel appeared, trotting purposefully from the direction of Hidden Springs. The Mustang approached without hesitation, greeting George with a gentle nudge before focusing intently on the maps. "He understands what we're planning," Allison observed, still documenting the horse's behaviors for her research. "The consistent intentionality is extraordinary, or exactly what you'd expect from an animal trained for media performances," came a new voice. Albert Thornton approached, with his legal team and 2 university professors who were clearly not part of the original research group. "These gentlemen are from the archaeology department at Western State." Thornton introduced them smoothly. "They've raised significant concerns about excavation protocols and authentication procedures at this site, meaning you've found experts willing to question our findings." Dr. Adams translated her expression. "Hardening convenient timing. Multiple perspectives benefit scientific integrity." Thornton replied, "They'll be accompanying your expedition today as independent observers." Before tensions could escalate further, Rebel moved deliberately toward the canyon that would lead them to Eagle's Height, looking back with clear expectation. "He's ready to go," George said simply, gathering his backpack. Anyone coming should prepare for rough terrain. The expedition that formed behind Rebel created an unlikely image. Archaeologists with equipment packs, tribal elders in traditional vests, law enforcement officers, media representatives, and even Thornton's skeptical experts, all following a wild Mustang who moved with absolute certainty through the landscape. Peter fell into step beside his father as they navigated a steep section of the trail. "This is not how I expected my business trip to Chicago to end," he admitted. "Riley, life rarely follows our expectations." George replied, "Your mother taught me that you mention her a lot lately. Being part of something meaningful again reminds me of her." Ruth never saw barriers, only possibilities, Peter absorbed. This in silence as they continued climbing. The path grew more challenging, winding through rock formations that would have been nearly impossible to navigate without Rebel's guidance. The Mustang consistently selected routes manageable for humans, while avoiding dead ends and unstable terrain. "If this is performance training," Diana Wells commented, recording the journey, "it's beyond anything I've seen in 30 years of journalism." After nearly 2 hours of hiking, they reached a natural overlook. Below, the entire valley spread out in panoramic beauty, Guardian Rock visible in the distance with Hidden Springs catching morning light. Liberty Mesa's full expanse became clear from this vantage point, along with something else. "Look there," Allison pointed toward the northern boundary of the mesa. Those access roads weren't on any of the development plans Thornton submitted publicly. Visible from their elevation were freshly graded roads leading to what appeared to be preliminary drilling, sites industrial activity completely unrelated to resort development, resource testing. Ryan confirmed quietly, having joined their group. The internal plans include mineral extraction operations, hidden behind the resort development Thornton overhearing. This exchange maintained his composure. Preliminary geological surveys are standard procedure for any major development safety considerations. Those aren't settlement test drills. George counted their core samples for mining operations before Thornton could respond. Rebel nickered sharply. Drawing their attention back to the immediate mission, the Mustang had moved to a rock formation at the overlook's highest point, a natural stone column that indeed resembled an eagle with outstretched wings when viewed from their approach angle, eagle's height. Dr. Adams confirmed, comparing the formation to Whitfield's descriptions. Rebel poured at the base of the formation, focusing on a section where rocks had been deliberately positioned. As the archaeological team carefully removed these stones, they revealed a small protected cavity containing a metal box sealed with wax military document case, 1880 standard issue. Dr. Adams identified it, excellent preservation condition, as the conservators began the delicate process of documenting and opening the container. Thornton's experts pressed forward, insisting on verification procedures. The resulting delay created a tense standoff until Sheriff Cooper intervened, given the evidence of prior knowledge concealment. All findings will be documented with multiple witnesses present. He announced, establishing a perimeter that gave the primary research team space to work, while allowing observation when the case was finally opened. Its contents proved more significant than anyone had anticipated. Official territorial maps with original boundaries, clearly marked documents bearing government seals that authorized tribal claims to lands including Liberty Mesa, and handwritten affidavit from both military personnel and tribal leaders establishing agreed boundaries. Most damning was a letter signed by a territorial commissioner explicitly ordering these documents destroyed and boundaries redrawn to exclude mineral-rich territories, deemed necessary for national interests. This is evidence of historical fraud at the federal level. Dr. Adams explained, her professional demeanor strained by the significance of their discovery. These documents legally establish Native American ownership of lands that were subsequently seized through falsified boundaries. Ernest and the tribal elders examined the documents with solemn recognition. These are the papers our ancestors spoke of. Ernest confirmed the lost proof of our rightful claims. While the research team cataloged these findings, George noticed Rebel had moved to another section of the overlook, where unusual rock formations created a natural shelter. The Mustang waited patiently until George joined him, then indicated a narrow opening between boulders. "There's something else here." George called to the others. Carefully navigating the opening revealed a protected alcove, containing what appeared to be a grave site, stones arranged in a deliberate pattern, with a simple marker carved into the central stone, JW 187. "We found Whitfield," Dr. Adams breathed as she joined George. The grave had been carefully constructed to remain undisturbed by elements, the stones placed with evident respect. Nearby lay the remains of a leather satchel containing personal effects, a pocket watch, letters, and a final journal entry written on a single preserved page. "I have chosen to remain with those who speak truth, rather than return to those who will profit from lies." Dr. Adams read aloud, "Should these words be found, know that James Whitfield died free among friends rather than live constrained by false orders." The discovery created profound silence among the gathered witnesses. Even Thornton's experts appeared moved by this direct connection to a man who had chosen conscience over duty. Nearly 130 years earlier, Thornton himself stood apart. His customary poise visibly shaken. The documentation discovered at Eagle's Height not only established historical fraud, but potentially invalidated current ownership claims derived from those fraudulent boundaries, including development rights his company had purchased at considerable expense. Ryan approached George quietly during the documentation process. "There's something else you should know. The geological surveys identified substantial gold deposits still present throughout this area, particularly beneath Sacred Circle. Thornton's resort was never the primary objective. It was just cover for a modern mining operation." "Gold," George said. Understanding dawning the same. "Reason. The boundaries were falsified and Whitfield's time history repeating itself." Allison agreed, joining them, though this time with better documentation of the deception, as the implications of these discoveries spread through the gathered group. Peter watched his father with new understanding. The principled stance George had maintained wasn't mere stubborn idealism, but recognition of something genuinely worth protecting. "You knew, didn't you?" Peter asked quietly, not the specifics, but that there was something important here beyond just archaeology. George shook his head. "I only knew it mattered to him." He indicated Rebel, who stood watching the proceedings with ancient patience, and that was enough reason to listen. The return journey to the excavation base camp was subdued. Each person processing the significance of their discoveries, state authorities had already been contacted regarding the historical documentation, with preliminary conversations about federal review of the land claims. Thornton, recognizing his position had become untenable, attempted damage control, approaching Allison as they descended the final stretch of canyon. "Your research center does valuable work," he offered without preamble. "My foundation's concerns about methodology could be easily resolved with a suitable interpretation of today's findings. The directorship position opening next month would provide an excellent platform for a measured, scientific perspective." Allison's expression remained neutral. "Are you offering me a promotion in exchange for discrediting my own research? I'm suggesting your career need not be collateral damage in a complex historical dispute." Thornton clarified. "Smoothly reasonable experts can disagree on interpretations while maintaining professional advancement." "Except, I'm not a reasonable expert," Allison replied. "I'm a scientist who follows evidence regardless of where it leads, but thank you for clarifying." Your foundation's definition of research integrity. By late afternoon, the base camp had transformed into an impromptu command center. Representatives from the State Historical Society, Bureau of Land Management, and tribal authorities converged to begin the complex process of evaluating the legal implications of the discovered documents. Diana Wells's continuous reporting had attracted national media attention, with satellite trucks now parked along the access road. What had begun as a local curiosity had become a story about historical justice, indigenous rights, and the unexpected role of a wild Mustang in bringing truth to light. Throughout these developments, Rebel maintained a calm presence, grazing peacefully near Guardian Rock, while occasionally observing the human activities with evident interest. His band had returned to the ridgeline overlooking the valley, their silhouettes visible at sunset like sentinels watching over the proceedings. As twilight approached, Ernest and the tribal elders completed their translation of the petroglyphs, assembling the fragments into a cohesive narrative that connected directly to their discoveries. The rock writings tell of a time when men came seeking yellow metal beneath sacred land. Nest explained to the gathered researchers. They speak of a pale man who chose truth over loyalty to his kind, who lived his final days with our people, helping hide proof of our rightful claims until justice would return. "Westfield," George confirmed. Ernest nodded, and they speak of the messenger horses, special animals who would carry knowledge between worlds and reveal hidden truths. When the land faced threat again, as these words were translated, Rebel approached Ernest with the same deliberate dignity he had shown throughout. The elder reached out slowly, placing his weathered hand on the Mustang's forehead, directly over the white blaze marking the sign of wisdom. Ernest said softly, just as the old stories described that evening as portable. Lights illuminated the excavation site for continued work. George found a quiet moment with Peter away from the activity. They sat on a rock outcropping overlooking the valley, sharing coffee from George's thermos. "I understand now," Peter said, after a long silence, "why this place matters to you, why you couldn't just sell and walk away. It's not just the land," George replied. "It's what it represents. Connection, continuity. The idea that some things should remain wild and free, like your Mustang." Friend Peter gestured toward Rebel, who grazed nearby within earshot. "I have to admit, watching him these past 2 days, it's remarkable. Unexplainable, but remarkable. Some things don't need explanation to be true." They sat in companionable silence, father and son finding common ground after years of distance. The stars emerged overhead. The same stars Westfield would have seen from this valley, as he made his fateful choice to stand with truth rather than convenience. "What happens now, Peter?" finally asked. "The legal process will take years." George acknowledged. "Establishing historical land rights, determining appropriate protections for both the archaeological sites and the Mustang territory, and Three Pines Farm." George looked toward his property, just visible in the distance. "It remains what it's always been, a place that connects past and present." Your mother understood that. I think maybe you're starting to. As well as night settled fully over Liberty Mesa, plans were already forming among the assembled authorities, researchers, and community members. What had begun with one man feeding a hungry wild horse had catalyzed a movement to protect not just historical artifacts, but living heritage, the wild Mustangs who had preserved a century-old truth until the moment was right for its revelation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as Thornton's legal team would inevitably fight to minimize the implications of their discoveries. But tonight, watching rebels standing, sentinel under starlight, George felt a certainty transcending rational explanation that some connections between humans and the natural world ran deeper than modern understanding could fully comprehend, and that some messages could indeed span generations when carried by the right messenger. Autumn painted Liberty Mesa in gold and crimson as George stood on his porch, watching the season's first tour group follow Allison along the newly established Heritage Trail. 6 months had transformed the landscape, not just physically with the carefully designed paths and formational markers, but in deeper ways that reflected a community's reconnection with its past. "Never thought I'd see the day," Sheriff Cooper remarked, joining George with coffee, mugs in hand. 3 Pines Farm as the gateway to a national heritage site. George accepted the offered mug with a nod. Ruth would have loved it. She always said this land had stories to tell if we just listened. The Liberty Mesa Heritage Preserve had become official just 3 weeks earlier, after an expedited federal review process. Unusual in its speed and decisiveness, the evidence discovered in Westfield's caches had proven impossible to dispute even by Thornton's expensive legal team. Historical land fraud at territorial levels had triggered jurisdiction that superseded modern development claims. "Spoke with Ryan yesterday," Howard mentioned casually. "He's settling into his new position with the Preservation Foundation. Says he's never been happier than working on the right side of history." Ryan's decision to testify against his former employer had cost him his corporate career, but earned him something more valuable. The young man who had once helped plan Liberty Mesa's destruction now helped coordinate its protection, his intimate knowledge of Thornton's operations proving invaluable to investigators. George's attention shifted to a familiar figure approaching from the direction of Hidden Springs. Rebel trotted along the fence line, his coat gleaming in the autumn sunlight, though the Mustang still led his band throughout Liberty Mesa's protected expanse. He maintained a special connection with 3 Baines Farm, visiting almost daily. "Still can't believe that horse." Howard shook his head in wonderment. "University researchers from across the country, and nobody can explain it. Some things don't need scientific explanation to be true," George replied. Reaching for the basket of apples he now kept permanently by the porch steps, as Rebel approached, several tourists noticed and cameras immediately raised to capture the now famous Mustang, whose extraordinary behavior had launched what media outlets called the Westfield revelation. Allison smoothly integrated his appearance into her tour narrative, explaining the unique relationship between the wild horses and the historical site. The Mustang preservation program alone would have been significant, Howard noted, but combined with the historical justice aspects and the tribal land recognition, it's become something bigger than anyone expected. The preservation designation had indeed grown beyond initial expectations. What began as archaeological protection had expanded to include substantial restoration of tribal access rights, establishment of protected corridors for wildlife movement, and a groundbreaking co-management structure that incorporated traditional indigenous knowledge into conservation practices. George descended the porch steps, apples in hand, as Rebel reached the fence. The connection between man and horse had deepened over months of shared purpose, evolving into something that defied conventional categories, neither domestic partnership nor wild separation, but something unique that honored both human and Iguan dignity. "Morning, old friend," George greeted softly, offering an apple on open palm. Rebel accepted the offering with gentle precision, dark eyes holding George's gaze with the same intelligence that had first arrested his attention that drought-stricken day behind them. Tourists whispered and photographed, but neither man nor horse seemed concerned with their audience. "Dad," Peter's voice called from the driveway where his car had just arrived. Unlike his first appearance 6 months earlier, Peter now looked comfortable in casual clothes appropriate for desert living, his corporate stiffness gradually softening with each visit. More surprising was his announcement after joining them. It's official, they've approved my transfer request. The regional office in Juniper Springs opens next month. You're really doing this? George asked, genuine surprise in his voice. Leaving Chicago, Peter nodded, a weight visibly lifted from his shoulders. Banking happens everywhere. And after everything that's happened, priorities changed. The transformation in their relationship had been as unexpected as everything else. Stemming from Rebel's first appearance, weekly visits had become regular working. Weekends at Three Pines' farm, with Peter gradually rediscovering connections to the land that his urban career had buried rather than erased. Rebel observed this reunion with apparent approval before turning his attention to a vehicle approaching. Along the Heritage Trail, Dr. Adams returning from the morning's excavation work at Eagle's Height. The ongoing archaeological research continued to yield insights into both Westfield's story and the longer indigenous history of Liberty Mesa. The National Museum confirmation came through. She announced joining their informal gathering. The territorial documents are authentic beyond any doubt. They're sending a permanent conservation team. Next month, the historical significance of their discoveries had grown with each new finding. What began as local history had expanded into a case study in territorial expansion. Ethics now featured in university curricula. Nationwide, Westfield's choice to ally with truth rather than authority had transformed. From forgotten footnote to celebrated example of moral courage, there's more. Dr. Adams continued, her professional demeanor brightened by genuine excitement. The complete translation of the pictographs is finished. The narrative they tell is remarkable and explains much about our friend here. She nodded toward Rebel, who had maintained his position by the fence, apparently listening to their conversation with characteristic focus. According to the translated narrative, certain horses were considered keepers of memory animals believed to carry ancestral knowledge through generations. They were identified by specific markings and behavior patterns, particularly their willingness to approach humans during times of need. Like Rebel's blaze marking, George observed exactly the pictographs describe how these special horses would protect important sites and reveal hidden knowledge when threats emerged to sacred places. The stories mention them bringing signs and markers to chosen people. Saddlebags and cavalry buttons, Howard translated, glancing at Rebel with renewed wonder. Dr. Adams nodded. The interesting part is the scientific correlation. The Mustang herds in this region have remained relatively isolated genetically. Some behaviors could theoretically be passed through generations through both genetics and observational learning within tight-knit bands, meaning there's a natural explanation. Peter suggested a potential natural framework. Dr. Adams corrected gently the specificity of Rebel's behavior, selecting particular historical artifacts, delivering them to the specific person whose property bordered the threatened land, leading researchers to multiple connected sites. That level of apparent intentionality remains extraordinary by any scientific standard. Throughout this discussion, Rebel had maintained his attentive presence, ears flicking toward each speaker in turn. Now he nickered softly, drawing their attention before turning to look toward the visitor center, where tourists were gathering for the afternoon program. I think he's reminding us we have responsibilities. George smiled. The 2-hour presentation starts soon. The visitor center, converted from George's old barn with careful preservation of its historical elements, had become the preserve's educational hub 3 times daily. Presentations explained the interconnected stories of Westfield, the boundary disputes, indigenous history, and the Mustang's role in bringing these elements together. Diana Wells had parlayed her exclusive coverage into a position with a major conservation magazine. Her latest article prominently displayed in the Sense reading area, Messengers Across Time, how wild horses preserved historical truth, had brought national attention not just to Liberty Mesa, but to wild horse conservation efforts throughout the West. As George prepared for his part in the presentation, sharing the personal aspects of how feeding a hungry wild horse had cascaded into historical revelation, he reflected on how profoundly his life had changed in 6 short months. The farm that had become a lonely monument to loss after Ruth's death now hummed with purpose. The finances that had teetered on collapse were stabilized through his position as heritage site coordinator. Most importantly, the isolation that had defined his widowhood had yielded to genuine community with Three Pines Farm. transformed from boundary marker to connection point. The legal aftermath for Thornton Enterprises continued to unfold with multiple investigations into deliberate concealment of historical evidence, regulatory violations, and potential fraud regarding mineral rights claims. Albert Thornton himself had retreated from public view, his reputation irrevocably damaged by evidence that he had knowingly attempted to destroy historically significant sites for mining profits. The afternoon presentation concluded with visitors proceeding to the viewing platform overlooking Liberty Mesa, as if coordinated rebels band appeared on a distant ridge, wild Mustangs silhouetted against the autumn sky in a scene that invariably drew gasps of appreciation. They seemed to know exactly when to appear, a visitor commented in amazement. Perhaps they do. George replied simply later as sunset painted the mesa in spectacular hues. George met Allison at Hidden Springs, where her research team was concluding the day's observations, her work documenting. The Mustang's behaviors had expanded into a permanent research program, with preliminary findings challenging conventional understanding of wild horse cognition and social structures. The university approved the 5-year extension, she informed him. As they walked the perimeter of Sacred Circle, we'll be able to study multiple generations within the herd, tracking how behaviors are transmitted and maintained. And your funding concerns? George asked, knowing how Thornton's foundation had threatened her career during the early revelations. Allison smiled, replaced threefold by institutions without conflicts of interest. Ethical research attracts ethical support. It turns out their partnership had developed into something neither had anticipated: professional collaboration enriched by deepening personal connection. The shared experience of discovering Liberty Mesa's secrets had created understanding that transcended conventional relationship development. As night fell, George returned to his porch, the lights of Three Pines Farm reflecting the property's evolution. Where once a single lamp had burned in solitary vigilance, now warmer illumination spilled from windows of the Visitor Center research station and newly renovated farmhouse. Where Peter would establish his part-time residence, Rebel remained at the fence line, seemingly reluctant to return to his band. Despite the advancing darkness, the Mustang's continued presence defied easy categorization, neither fully wild nor domesticated, but operating according to his own understanding of appropriate relationship. You knew, didn't you? George asked quietly, joining the horse at the fence. Somehow you knew who I was, who I needed to become. Rebel's steady gaze offered no confirmation, beyond his continued presence, yet conveyed understanding that transcended the supposed barriers between species. With gentle deliberation, the Mustang pressed his forehead against George's outstretched hand, the white blaze warm beneath his palm. Tomorrow would bring new visitors eager to learn Liberty Mesa's interconnected stories of history, justice, and unexpected partnership. The legal processes establishing permanent protections would continue unfolding. Researchers would document and analyze, seeking rational frameworks for extraordinary events. But tonight, in the simple connection between a man who had offered an apple to a hungry wild horse and the remarkable animal who had delivered historical truth in return, existed something beyond convenient explanation. A reminder that the most profound relationships often begin with the simplest acts of kindness. As Rebel finally turned to rejoin his band, his silhouette momentarily outlined against the rising moon, George thought of Ruth and what she would have made of all that had transpired. Her favorite saying came back to him with new resonance. The heart recognizes truth before the mind can explain it. The wild Mustang disappeared into the darkness, returning to freedom rather than captivity. Exactly, as it should be. Yet the connection remained a bridge between worlds that neither required permanence nor yielded to separation. In that balanced relationship lay the deeper lesson of Liberty Mesa's revelation. The true preservation honors the wildness of what we protect while acknowledging our human connection to it. George turned toward his home, no longer just a house filled with memories of what was lost, but the living center of what had been found: purpose, community, and the profound understanding that sometimes the messengers of truth arrive in forms we least expect, carrying wisdom we most need to remember. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.